It started with a sound that no one should have heard beneath the city streets, a sound too alive, too deliberate, to belong to anything mechanical. Daniel Parker had worked for the city's Department of Infrastructure for nearly 15 years, and he had heard every kind of echo the underground had to offer, from dripping water to squealing rats to the groan of shifting steel. But that night, as he leaned over the entrance of a service tunnel that hadn't been used in decades, the echo that rose up to meet him was a low, guttural breathing, as though the tunnel itself had lungs and was waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside. Daniel had been sent with his younger partner, Jacob, to investigate reports of strange noises and occasional blackouts in the surrounding neighborhoods. On paper, the assignment was routine, some loose wiring, maybe a burst pipe causing interference. But the locals whispered something different. They said the tunnel beneath Hawthorne Street was cursed, sealed off 30 years ago after workers vanished without a trace. The city dismissed those stories as superstition, of course, but when Daniel stood at the mouth of that tunnel with a cold wind curling out from its depths, he felt the stories wrap around him like chains. "You feel that?" Jacob asked, his voice shaking as he adjusted his flashlight. He was fresh out of training, still believing every job could be solved with the right wrench or breaker switch. But his hand trembled so badly the beam of his flashlight stuttered across the concrete wall. Daniel nodded slowly. "Air shouldn't be moving down there," he said, and his own voice sounded foreign to him, hushed by the weight of what lay beneath. They strapped on their helmets, clipped the radios to their belts, and stepped inside. The first thing Daniel noticed was the silence. The traffic from the city above vanished instantly, smothered by the tunnel's damp walls. Their boots crunched against gravel and debris, and each footstep echoed so far down the tunnel it was impossible to tell if it belonged to them or something following just out of sight. Jacob muttered under his breath, "Feels like walking into a tomb." His flashlight caught the rusted remains of old pipes bolted to the walls, corroded valves that hadn't been touched in years, and patches of graffiti so faded they looked like claw marks instead of paint. Daniel's own light swept across the walls and froze. There, smeared along the concrete in a pattern too messy to be graffiti, was a streak of dark brown, dried long ago. Blood. Lots of it. It had dripped downward into the cracks of the floor as though someone had been dragged screaming into the blackness ahead. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep walking, but in his chest his heart thundered so loud he feared Jacob would hear it. "Looks old," Daniel muttered. "Could be an accident from back when this place was active." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. That much blood didn't come from an accident. It came from something violent, something deliberate. The deeper they went, the more the air changed. It grew thicker, harder to breathe, as if the tunnel itself was choking them. Jacob coughed and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Why does it feel so hot down here? There's no steam lines anymore." Daniel had no answer. The heat wasn't natural. It came in pulses, waves that almost felt like the breath of something massive hidden just beyond the curve of the tunnel. They reached an intersection where the main passage split into two, and Daniel stopped, raising his hand to silence Jacob. From the left tunnel came the faint sound of dripping water, but from the right there was movement. Slow, scraping, dragging movement, like nails or bones being pulled across stone. And beneath it, a sound that made Daniel's blood run cold. Whispering, he couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was speaking in the dark, something that had no right to be human. Jacob whispered, "Did you hear that?" And Daniel placed a finger to his lips. He tilted his head, straining to catch the words, but the whispers died instantly, as if whatever had spoken knew it had been heard. A sharp metallic clang echoed from the right tunnel, so loud and sudden that Jacob jumped back, nearly dropping his flashlight. "Maybe it's squatters," Jacob said quickly, clinging to logic. "People hiding down here. We should call it in." But Daniel shook his head. He wasn't sure why. Protocol said they should report any suspicious presence immediately, but something told him that calling it in wouldn't help. No one would come. No one sane would walk down here if they knew what waited at the end. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and motioned toward the right passage. Against every instinct screaming at him to turn back, he led Jacob into the blackness. As they walked, the tunnel seemed to close around them. The walls pressed in, dripping with condensation, and the ground sloped downward so gradually they almost didn't notice until their calves ached with the strain. The whispers returned, but softer now, rising and falling as though dozens of voices were murmuring in unison just beyond the reach of their lights. Jacob pressed the radio to his mouth. "Dispatch, this is Parker Team, do you copy?" Static answered him, sharp and endless. He tried again, louder, but the only reply was the whispering growing louder, closer, crawling beneath his skin. Daniel felt it too, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the flashlight. He wanted to turn back, to drag Jacob with him, but just ahead the tunnel widened into a chamber. At its center stood something that froze him in place. It was an old maintenance platform, rusted and covered in grime, surrounded by chains bolted into the floor. But the chains weren't empty. Something was inside them. A shape crouched low to the ground, limbs folded at unnatural angles, its back rising and falling in heavy breaths. At first Daniel thought it was a person, some homeless soul chained by cruel hands, but when the figure shifted and its face lifted toward the light, he realized nothing human could look like that. Its skin was pale and stretched thin across its skull, its eyes glowing faintly yellow, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream, jagged teeth glistening as though wet. The chains clinked as it moved, and then, without warning, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. Jacob gasped, stumbling backward, and his boots scraped against a loose stone. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The creature's head snapped toward them, its body lurching upright with a speed that blurred the edges of Daniel's vision. It let out a shriek, not from its mouth but from everywhere at once, a sound that rattled the chains, shook the walls, and made both men drop to their knees clutching their ears. The lights flickered, the chamber plunged into darkness, and when Daniel raised his head again, the chains were broken. Something was free. Daniel's flashlight beam shook wildly as he scrambled to his feet, the light catching only fragments of movement as the thing slid into the shadows of the chamber. Chains clattered uselessly against the stone floor, and every instinct told him that running was the only option, but his legs felt rooted, as if the very air had thickened to trap him. Jacob's breathing turned ragged. "Daniel, what the hell is that?" His voice cracked, high and thin, like a terrified child. Daniel grabbed his arm, forcing him back toward the tunnel they had come from, but as soon as they turned, the darkness behind them seemed alive. Shapes flickered at the edges of their vision, figures without faces melting in and out of the shadows, each whispering in a voice that did not belong to them. They ran, boots crashing against the stone, flashlights cutting narrow paths of light, hearts pounding so violently it hurt to breathe. The whispers chased them, swirling around their heads until words began to form. "Stay with us," the voices hissed, overlapping, until it was impossible to know how many spoke or how close they were. Jacob shouted into the radio again, but all that came back was the shriek of static, a sound that blended with the whispers until Daniel wanted to tear the radio from his partner's hands and smash it against the wall. They reached the intersection again and stumbled to a halt, gasping for air. Daniel spun in circles with the flashlight, searching for the thing that had been chained, but the tunnel was empty. Too empty. The dripping water from the left passage had stopped, as if the tunnel itself was holding its breath. Daniel took a shaky step forward, but his boot slipped on something slick. He lowered the beam of his flashlight and froze. The floor was wet, but not with water. Blood pooled thick and black under the light, seeping from cracks in the walls, trickling from the ceiling, filling the air with the stench of iron. Jacob gagged, his stomach heaving, but Daniel yanked him upright, whispering fiercely, "Don't stop. Keep moving." The deeper they went, the stranger the tunnel became. The graffiti was gone now, replaced by carvings etched deep into the stone, twisting symbols that made Daniel's eyes burn when he looked at them too long. The air pulsed with heat again, but now it carried a smell so foul it coated their throats. Rotting meat, burned hair, something alive left too long in the dark. Daniel's flashlight flickered, dimmed, then steadied, but he could feel the battery draining faster than it should. Behind them came another sound, low and steady, like something dragging its body along the floor. Jacob gripped Daniel's shoulder, nails biting through his jacket. "It's following us." Then the tunnel widened again into a second chamber, and this one was worse, much worse. The walls were lined with alcoves, shallow recesses carved into the stone. Inside each alcove sat a body, dozens of them. Men and women in decaying uniforms, city worker jackets from decades ago, faces shriveled, eyes sunken but mouths wide open as if frozen in a final scream. Their skin was stretched so tight it looked like parchment, but their hands clawed outward, nails broken against the stone, as though they had been trying to crawl out. Jacob backed against the wall, shaking his head violently. No, this isn't real. But Daniel knew it was. He recognized the faded patch on one of the jackets, the city's old logo, the same one stamped on his own sleeve. These were the workers who had vanished 30 years ago. A soft rustling broke the silence, and Daniel lifted his light to one of the alcoves. For a moment he wished he hadn't. One of the bodies was moving. Its fingers twitched, curling and uncurling slowly, scraping against the stone. Then another stirred, then another. The sound of nails on rock multiplied, a rising chorus of scraping, until the entire chamber rattled with it. One by one, the corpses began to lift their heads. Their mouths opened wider, impossibly wide, and from their throats came the whispers, louder now, echoing in unison. "Stay with us." Jacob screamed and bolted, darting into a narrow passage at the far end of the chamber. Daniel had no choice but to follow, his chest burning with fear and exhaustion. The tunnel sloped even further downward now, as if leading them into the bowels of the earth. The scraping followed, the whispers chasing them, but ahead was only more darkness. Jacob's flashlight cut across something carved into the wall, fresh scratches, long and jagged, spelling words in broken letters. No way out. Their footfalls echoed endlessly, but then a new sound bled through, faint at first but growing with each step. A steady thump, 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 like the beating of a massive heart buried deep within the stone. The walls vibrated with it, dust falling from the ceiling, and Daniel felt his chest synchronize unwillingly, his own heartbeat matching the rhythm. Jacob pressed his hands over his ears, shouting, "It's inside me. Make it stop." But there was no stopping it. The tunnel shook harder, the air became molten, and Daniel realized the heartbeat wasn't coming from beneath them. It was surrounding them, as if the tunnel itself was alive. Then they saw it. At the end of the passage, the stone walls gave way to something that was not stone at all. A vast chamber stretched before them, its walls pulsing and slick, as though carved from flesh rather than rock. Veins glowed faintly beneath the surface, carrying black liquid that pulsed in time with the monstrous heartbeat. In the center of the chamber was an altar built from rusted pipes and broken concrete, and upon it lay the remains of countless bodies, stacked and fused together, their faces locked in silent agony. Standing over them was the creature, taller now, its limbs elongated, its skin glistening with fresh blood. It turned its glowing eyes toward Daniel and Jacob and spoke for the first time. "You should not have come." The creature's voice was not a sound made by lungs or throat. It was the grinding of stone, the hiss of steam, the cry of every lost soul in the walls of the tunnel, layered together into something that rattled their bones. Jacob stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering uselessly to the floor, the beam slicing across the pulsing walls. "Daniel, we have to go now," he gasped. But his words came out thin and useless in the massive chamber. Daniel held his light steady, though his hand shook so violently the beam wavered across the creature's skin, revealing more detail than his mind could stand. It was human, at least it had been once, but its flesh was stretched and warped, as if melted and remolded into a form too long, too thin. Its face split where a mouth should have been, replaced instead with a cavern of jagged teeth. The chains from the earlier chamber still clung to its limbs, dragging behind it like broken shackles, dripping with dark fluid that hissed when it hit the stone floor. The heartbeat of the chamber quickened, pounding faster and faster until Daniel thought his chest would rupture. He tried to step back, but the floor beneath him rippled, soft and spongy, like standing on muscle instead of stone. Jacob screamed again, falling to his knees, clawing at his chest as if he could rip the sound out of his body. The creature stepped closer, its feet sinking slightly into the living ground, and each step sent a vibration through Daniel's bones. "You belong here," it said, and though its cavernous mouth never moved, the words slid straight into his head, cold and final. Like the others. The walls shifted then, and the alcoves that had lined the earlier chamber now stretched around them in this fleshy cavern. The corpses were here too, pressed into the walls like flies in amber, their mouths still open, their eyes rolling beneath translucent skin. Some of them Daniel recognized. He saw faces from old news clippings, the missing workers who had been swallowed by the tunnels. But then he saw others, faces from his own life. His grandfather who had disappeared when Daniel was a child. His cousin who had never been found after wandering into the wrong neighborhood years ago. Even his mother's face pressed against the wall, though she was alive and well above ground. Her mouth opened, whispering the same phrase as the rest. "Stay with us," Jacob snapped, his mind breaking under the weight of it all. He grabbed a jagged piece of rusted pipe from the altar and swung it wildly at the creature. The sound it made when the metal connected was not the sound of flesh, but of stone cracking. The creature staggered, but only for a moment. It turned its glowing eyes on Jacob, and the walls responded, tendrils of pulsing flesh shooting outward, wrapping around his arms, his legs, his throat. He dropped the pipe, his flashlight spinning uselessly across the ground, and let out a scream that turned to a gargle as the tendrils dragged him toward the wall. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing his partner's hand, pulling with everything he had, but Jacob's eyes were wide and glassy now, his lips mouthing words Daniel could not hear. With a final wrench, the wall swallowed him whole, sealing over as if he had never existed, leaving Daniel clutching only the echo of his partner's last scream. Alone now, Daniel staggered back, the flashlight beam quivering across the altar, the walls, the thing that towered over him. The creature bent low, its cavern mouth inches from Daniel's face, its breath hot and rancid, carrying with it the stench of every corpse in the chamber. "You are already ours," it whispered, and Daniel's mind flooded with visions. He saw the tunnels as they truly were, not stone and brick but veins and arteries, a network of living flesh stretching beneath the entire city. He saw workers from decades past dragged screaming into the dark, their bodies broken, their souls fed into the pulsing walls. He saw himself, kneeling in this chamber, his skin peeling back, his flesh joining the others, his face pressed forever into the wall to whisper for eternity. But then something inside him snapped, a raw surge of desperation overpowering the paralysis of fear. He stumbled toward the altar, grabbing the rusted pipe Jacob had dropped. His hands bled as the jagged metal cut his palms, but he didn't stop. With a scream that tore his throat, he drove the pipe into the glowing veins of the wall. The chamber erupted. The heartbeat faltered, the walls shuddered, black liquid spewing from the puncture. The corpses shrieked in unison, their mouths stretching impossibly wide, their voices filling the chamber with a sound so piercing Daniel's ears ruptured, blood running down his neck. The creature howled, its body thrashing, its chains whipping against the altar. Daniel ran. He didn't know where the tunnel was anymore, didn't know if he was moving upward or deeper, but he ran through corridors that twisted and bled, through walls that reached for him with grasping hands, through whispers that promised relief if he only stopped fighting. His flashlight sputtered and died, leaving him in pitch black, but his legs carried him anyway, blind, desperate. He felt the floor rising, felt the air cool, until at last he burst into a smaller tunnel lined with stone and brick again. The sound of dripping water returned, faint but real. He clawed his way upward, hands tearing on broken ladders, until finally he reached a rusted grate. With a strength he didn't know he had, he forced it open and dragged himself onto wet pavement. He was outside. The city loomed above him, the night air sharp and clean in his lungs. Rain fell softly, washing the blood from his face, but his body shook uncontrollably. He turned back to the grate, half expecting the creature to surge through after him, but nothing came. Only silence. He staggered into the street, collapsing beneath the glow of a flickering streetlight, his mind spinning with what he had seen. Hours later, rescue crews found him. They asked where Jacob was, what had happened in the tunnels, but Daniel could not answer. He sat wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide, lips trembling, staring at the grate in the street as if it might open again at any second. Days passed, and though he was released from the hospital, he never returned to the tunnels. He never spoke of what he saw, not to his superiors, not to his family. But he heard it every night. The heartbeat, slow at first, steady and patient, growing louder with each passing hour, until it filled his ears, his chest, his very soul. Sometimes he would wake to find blood seeping through the cracks in his apartment walls, dripping onto the floor before vanishing as if it had never been there. Sometimes he heard Jacob's voice whispering from the dark corners of his room, begging him to come back. And sometimes, when he stood in the silence of the city at night, he swore he could feel the ground breathing beneath his feet. The city slept above, oblivious, but Daniel knew the truth. The tunnels were alive. They were hungry. And one day soon the heartbeat would rise again, louder than ever, and the city above would learn what lurked beneath it.